No, I thank the university, I thank you personally, I thank the ambassadors and all the Italians who are here. It's crowded because the Italians have arrived. We tend to be many. I like this room. It's absolutely fantastic. It gives the sense of what a library is and how you can use it. Having said so, I will use my few minutes by answering myself to some of the questions that I have been hearing for months and even before in relation to the unification of Italy, and then ready to answer other questions, and possibly also the ones I'm going to answer myself before, if you are not satisfied with what I say. Well, the first question that has to be answered, and you shouldn't be surprised because it is due to a discussion that was held in Italy before the celebrations and somehow even during this year. And the question is, was it worth doing it? Did we really need unifying Italy? Because I don't know whether some of you reads an Italian journal which is quite good, Limes, the editor of which is Lucio Caracciolo. Months ago he started a sort of survey among his readers on do we need Italy? Is Italy necessary? The astonishing thing, at least for several of us, was that there were some Italians saying, no, Italy is not necessary at all. So it is something that comes from the, let's say, climate that we have in part of northern Italy mostly. But the fact of the matter is that demonstrating that unifying Italy was useful is something that deserves to be done. Now the answer is unavoidably yes, it was worth doing it. Because those who are complaining with the fact that previous divisions have been abolished tend to ignore what the conditions of Italy were, of the several parts of the country were before unification. Now, like it or not, Italy, which had been one of the most flourishing parts of Europe in the 13th, 14th, 15th, up to the 16th century, had 2 centuries of heavy decline. Substantially when the others unified themselves into the national states in France, in Spain, and also in the UK, not in Germany. And we remain somehow behind this process. One of the consequences of it was that Italy was dominated by others, piece by piece, ruled by others, etc. The fact of the matter, please, those of you who are still young and who like reading, go back to Leopardi and read how Leopardi describes Italy of the beginning of the 19th century, and you will have the sense, sort of Eliot, only ruins and decay. The sense of the country that is more and more poor, more and more illiterate, more and more backward. And the figures that we have give evidence on this. While the, let's say, rate of illiteracy was in the other European countries, let's say between 30 and 50%. In Italy, we were on top of this list, we were around 80%. And while life expectancy was already over 40 in several European countries. In Italy it was around 30. And of course, other, let's say, figures could be given to demonstrate. I give you, there are so many Italians, the level of our infrastructures, not everybody in the States knows exactly where Livorno is, but most of the Italians do know. And they do know the distance between Livorno and Firenze and Florence. Mazzini, to Mazzini it took 23 hours to go from Livorno to Florence. And this tells you something about the conditions of our streets. We had few miles of railways, while the railways were already around our borders. And those of you who are familiar with Cavour know how he was enthusiastic after his visit to the UK in seeing how they had abolished distances by using trains to connect all of the parts of their country. And we had few miles, as you know, we had the Naples Portici, that was used by, let's say, the aristocracy of the kingdom to transfer their families during the weekend. And this was the only railway substantially we had at the time. Actually, Cavour's dream was to unify Italy, because only through unification Italy could be modernized. And somehow the backwardness of the country could be eliminated only by unifying it. And it makes a lot of sense, because you can't imagine infrastructures, roads, railways on a scale so small as the 7 states we had before unification. And this was most of the sense. We have figures telling us the limits of what the Italians have done since the unification, but also the achievements. And compared to the Italy we had before unification, there is no match, as we say in Italian, there is no match. Italy wins, in the sense that after being unified, Italy has little by little almost abolished illiteracy. The expectancy of life is now among the highest in the world. Our sanitary system is one of the best in the world, and all of the other figures give evidence of a country that is now one of the most significant ones in the world. So it was worth doing. The second question is, but couldn't we have a better Italy? After all, Garibaldi was fighting for another Italy. Mazzini was fighting for another Italy that was not necessarily the same of Garibaldi. Cavour, of course, was doing what he was doing, and he was the builder, really, of the Italy that eventually we had. Shouldn't we be unsatisfied? Haven't we lost an opportunity that through Mazzini and Garibaldi mostly Italy had to be better, to be already at the time a republic based on a constitutional assembly, more unified than eventually it succeeded in being. I mean, this dream of the other Italy has accompanied us since the unification of the existing one in 1861. Something that we have understood, like it or not, is the following. First, that the Italy we have is due to the efforts of all these heroes that we consider such for the country: Vittorio Emanuele, Cavour, Mazzini, Garibaldi. All of them were absolutely essential. Without Garibaldi, Italy would have never been unified, because never the Kingdom of Sardinia could have extended its reach toward southern Italy, which was not southern Italy, which was the kingdom of the two Sicilies of the time. Without Mazzini, probably the Italian adventure would have finished with Villafranca in 1859, with the agreement between France and Austria that limited to Lombardia the reward for the Italians of this war. But Mazzini and the Democrats, in the meantime, had organized provisional governments in several parts of the country, and throughout the plebisciti in the 2 years afterwards, parts of Italy that had been excluded by that agreement were unified with the Kingdom of Sardinia. So if Cavour eventually succeeded in unifying the entire country, he did it because of the work of Mazzini, because of the military action of Garibaldi. But, having said so, the conclusion, I repeat, like it or not, is that what Cavour built up by using all of these pieces was the only possible Italy that we could get. And that the other Italy was a wonderful dream which could not come true, for a very simple and realistic reason, because Italy was under limited sovereignty. All of its states were under limited sovereignty, no less than the states surrounding the Soviet Union in different conditions. But Italy was under the direct or indirect control of Great Britain, France, Austria, and somehow Germany, which did not exist at the moment, but Prussia existed. And all of them had their own interests in the one or the other part of our territory, and none of them was ready to accept an Italian republic born out of the subversive action of people like Mazzini and Garibaldi himself. And therefore, what they accepted, what they eventually accepted, was something that came out of the Kingdom of Sardinia, of the only Italian interlocutor they were ready somehow to accept. This has to be understood. Not all of us are ready to understand it. Not all of us are satisfied. If you say this, it seems that you are against dreaming something better. No, this is what history tells us, and this is something that has somehow to be accepted. Did we pay a price to it? Yes, we did. This was the only possible Italy. It was not so beautiful as the Italy of the dream could have been. Yes, it was not so beautiful, which does not exclude that it was the only possible one. We paid a price. Mostly the price was paid by the southern part of the country, by the fact that there was no understanding between the Northerns who came down and somehow conquered militarily the South, and they did not understand each other. The sense of frustration of southern Italy, due to the fact that they were somehow imposed upon the same rules that were uniformly applied throughout the entire country by the Kingdom of Sardinia, contributed a lot to reduces the sense of ownership that they should have had in relation to the unified Italy. They felt somehow as a sort of colony, dispossessed of their belongings and of their potential hopes for the future. The Italy of Cattaneo could have been much more useful, as Gaetano Salvemini clearly wrote years later. So, a centralized and uniform Italy was much worse than another Italy, but it was the only possible Italy. And we passed to regionalization, local responsibilities, only after the Constitution of 1948. So it took quite a lot of time before Cattaneo, who was right, could see his projects implemented actually in our republic. But somehow it was too late, because the shortcomings, cultural, of southern Italy have somehow remained where they were. The fact that so many Italians left the country at the beginning of the 20th century is a demonstration that something was not working in the only possible Italy. So there were things to be done. Not all of them have been done. So we paid a price. We also paid a price to the fact that Italy was created against the will of the Catholic Church, with a population that was mostly Catholic. The Questione Romana was quite a disturbing factor. No other process of national unity had to tackle this peculiar kind of issue that was so difficult to digest throughout the years. It is a fact that while I would challenge the representing the Risorgimento as a sort of elitarian kind of battle, which is not so. It was not elitarian. People from all over the Italian society contributed to the Risorgimento, and the urban poor gave quite a contribution to the Risorgimento in Naples, in Milan, in Rome, in Palermo. Despite this, we have to admit that millions and millions of peasants remained alien to this process, because they were out in principle, and they were even more out because they were Catholic, and their church was against this unified Italy. So this remained as a problem for several years, somehow making this unitarian state more fragile than needed. But this had happened. This had simply happened. And it took decades before this kind of issue could be solved. Something that you should consider, however, is that several Catholic Italians took part in the construction of the new Italy, not violating the non-expedit, the prohibition by the Pope to take part in the Italian parliamentary life, which meant that at the local level, several Catholic, let's say, newcomers could play a significant role. I mean, the first name you have to keep in mind is the name of Luigi Sturzo, who is considered the founder of the Popular Party and then of the Christian Democratic Party, who started his political life during the non-expedit in his small town in Caltagirone, being elected in the local council and playing a role there. The same was done by others, and therefore there was an organized life of Catholic politician at the grassroots of our society, even before the famous Gentiloni Agreement, which opened the way also to the Parliament. Another question that I'd like to raise with you is creating a nation, paying prices or not paying prices, means doing what? Using myths of national rhetoric, myths inventing history, myths creating divides in terms of ethnicity. The Italian race deserves a state, these kind of things. Is this the notion of nation that has been used by the Italians to build their Italy? This is very much important, also because, as you know, there are historians nowadays who challenge the sense of commemorating the formation of a nation, simply because they think that by definition the notion of nation is an ethnic, racist kind of notion. Well, I challenge this view. I think that it is historically wrong, while it can be historically right. It depends on the country you're speaking of. In the case of Italy, our notion of nation has always been a cultural notion, not an ethnic one. Not an ethnic one. For the very simple reason that the Italians came out of several populations, several groups that came down to our peninsula from several parts of Europe and who settled there. Longobards, Franks, Goths, Ostrogoths, Lebanese, Albanese, etc. All of them settled, and all of them became Italian. When we speak of the Italian language as a common asset of the entire country, we refer to something that has to be considered as a belonging of all of these populations that year after year became Italians. And this is the way. During the Risorgimento, the nation was preached by the historians of the time. Of course, part of our history was somehow reconstructed, as it always happens. History became contemporary history. The facts of the past were looked at as if they were anticipating somehow our national unity. Something that I have found a little bit funny is that I don't know whether some of you are familiar with the history of the ancient Rome and the war that divided after the death of Julius Caesar, Ottaviano, who became emperor later on, against Antonio, etc., Cleopatra, and that kind of story. If you haven't studied history, you have seen the movies. You know enough about it. Now, in the year 32 before Christ, all of the Italian provinces sworn their loyalty to Ottaviano. And he said, all of Italy is with me. Now, some historians have written that the first unification of Italy occurred with that conioratio. Now, it's not. It's not correct. Simply, this part of the Roman Empire was declaring its loyalty to Ottaviano. But there was no idea of unifying Italy at the time. Also, Francesco de Santis, who wrote a wonderful history of the Italian literature, presented in his work the literature before the 19th century as a preparation of the 19th century. But this is where that kind of artificial use of history stopped in our case, while in other cases past history was completely invented to give a sort of historical background to a process of national unity. It was not our case. It became racist in the 30s only. On the occasion of the horrible episode of the so-called racial laws, when all of the Italian Jews were declared foreign to the nation, not Italian citizens anymore, on the basis of racial reasons, assuming that their being Jews was the expression of their belonging to a different race, which is a sort of complete nonsense. I want to add that we had and still have a law on citizenship that can be very much criticized, that is mostly based on the so-called ius sanguinis more than on the so-called ius soli, which means that you are an Italian if your parents were Italian. You are not an Italian if you are born in Italy. But the sense of this law, considering the history of Italy, was not to exclude the newcomers, that were very few at the time, but to the opposite, was to include the Italian who were leaving the countries, to include the second and the third generations who, despite their being Americans, Australians, Belgians, Germans, etc., wanted to remain Italian, or at least Italy wanted them to remain Italian. And this was so the meaning that the ius sanguinis had for us in our law. It's time to change. It's time to recognize the ius sanguinis, but also to recognize the ius soli in Italy, because if we don't do it, year after year, we tend to return to a sort of racist notion of national identity, because there are so many Italians now living in Italy who are not considered Italians because they can't have the citizenship they are morally at least entitled to. I finish by telling you the lessons for the future that, in my view, we draw from this history, that are basically two. The first one is the clear relationship between the past and the future. We did not invent our past. We had a common past before our political and institutional unification, but the past would have never been enough for us to make the effort to run the risks, risking also life and losing life in some cases, were not for the prospect of the common future, and not only of the past that we already have. So the action that is necessary to create the conditions for unification is an action that is based on the firm belief that we can reach that future, that the future is worthwhile, and we work together for it. So if you don't have a future, the past remains silent. And you find what is common to you and the others in the past if you have the prospect of a common future. If you don't have the prospect of the common future, you find what is dividing, not what is unifying in your common past, which is something that somehow is a little bit happening now in Italy. Second, by having a future that is moving, that is somehow so compelling that you can't remain outside of the process, having this kind of thing, the youth takes part in this new process. One of the main problems we have today, it seems, is, and I say it as it's being frequently written, re-engaging the youth, which means that the youth is not engaged. Now, the lesson from our Risorgimento is that the youth did it. Basically, the youth did it. Because, as you know, Nino Bixio had 19 years when he was already in the Cinque Giornate di Milano, one of the main revolts of 48. Carlo Pisacane was in his 20s at the same time, and when he died in Sarpi, he was an over 30. That Mazzini founded the Giovane Italia when he was 25, Mameli was 19, and Cavour, the old prime minister who unified Italy, died in 61 when he was 51 years old. Garibaldi, in his 20s, was already a famous hero throughout the world. Now, what does it mean? That give the youth the prospect of a significant future, and the youth will be involved. This is perhaps the main lesson that we draw from our Risorgimento. And I've spent all of my time ready for your questions.